Hello, history class. So I'm going to start today by reviewing some of the things in our notes that we went over about Reconstruction, which is chapter 16. So if you haven't already, you're going to need your Reconstruction notes that you got last week. So go ahead and grab those out. And just to review a little bit, as I said, we're looking at Reconstruction in the nation, primarily in the South, because we're trying to rebuild the South at this point. Lincoln had a 10% plan that he wanted to put into effect. He wanted a very lenient method for the southern states to rejoin the Union. So he wanted to make it easy. He was looking at this 10% plan, meaning that 10% of the state's voters had to swear an oath of loyalty to the United States, and then they could organize new state governments. They could start sending their representatives to Congress and so on and so forth. Of course, they had to abolish slavery in the state. That was one of the stipulations that Lincoln had. But he was looking to grant amnesty, which is a group pardon, to the former Confederate soldiers, the ones who weren't officers or leaders in the Confederacy, but just people who had served. That's what he was looking to do in his plan. Of course, we know that he was assassinated just 5 days after Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, which ended the Civil War. So Lincoln himself was never able to actually put his plan into action. Congress had a different idea. They wanted to be stricter about Reconstruction and bringing the southern states back into the nation. So they differed on a lot of their ideas. There were a lot of radical Republicans at the time, people who were in the Republican Party that had strict ideas and policies that they wanted to put into place for the southern states who had seceded from the Union, who are now trying to come back into the Union. With Abraham Lincoln assassinated, Andrew Johnson, who was his vice president, becomes president of the United States. Andrew Johnson had the same ideas as Lincoln. He favored a lenient plan for Reconstruction. He was looking to issue basically amnesty to a lot of the former Confederates. He wanted the southern states to be able to organize their governments and their representatives elected to Congress to take their seats in Congress. Of course, he said that you had to also abolish slavery and so on and so forth. And at this point, the 13th Amendment would have been ratified, and so the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The states would have also had to agree to the 13th Amendment to ratify that. But at the time, under Andrew Johnson's plan, whenever it was time for Congress to come in session again, they were realizing that a lot of former leaders in the Confederacy were the people being elected back into office and trying to take seats in the House and the Senate. And so Congress was not happy about this. They weren't allowing those representatives to take their seats. Congress ends up finding out that black codes are being put into place in the South. Black codes were new laws used by southern states to control African Americans. It was basically replacing slavery with near slavery is what it was doing. For example, in Mississippi, African Americans couldn't vote or serve on juries. That was not the idea that the North and the Republicans had in mind at all. So there were a couple things that were put into place to try to stop some of this that was going on in the South. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was one of them. It granted citizenship to African Americans. It didn't necessarily have the gusto behind it to enforce all of that. So the 14th Amendment was also passed in Congress. This gave citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States. And a state that tried to deny any male citizen over 21 the right to vote, there were supposed to be consequences for that under the 14th Amendment. So that's a little bit of review. We are now on what would be the third page of our notes. It would say Radical Reconstruction at the top. So by early 1867, radical Republicans had enough support from moderates to begin hard Reconstruction. So that first blank is moderates to begin quote unquote hard Reconstruction. Like they wanted to come down hard on these southern states that were trying to pull things like black codes. on the African Americans. So they come up with the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Okay, that did a few things. First of all, it removed all governments, that's your blank, of southern states who refused to ratify the 14th, next blank, 14th Amendment. Of course, that's the citizenship, meaning that anyone born or naturalized in the U.S. is a citizen, which would include all African Americans. Second, it imposed military rule there. Military is your fill in the blank. In other words, it divided the states into 5, next blank, districts. So in other words, like they had soldiers come in to basically oversee these districts and make sure that rule and order was happening and that things weren't happening to African Americans that shouldn't be. Third thing, in order to rejoin the Union, a state would have to, number 1, write a new constitution. Constitution's that blank. Secondly, it would have to ratify the 14th Amendment. 14th is the next blank. And then, number 3, it would have to let African Americans vote. So vote is that next blank. Because things were being done in the South at the time to try to prevent African Americans from voting, which we will see. All right, and then the last bullet point there is just noting that this kind of helped transform the South into what at least the radical Republicans were hoping that it would look like. Soldiers, first blank, soldiers registered black voters in order to ensure that they were going to be able to vote. Next thing, black voters actually outnumbered whites in 5 states. So outnumbered is there because they could vote now. They didn't have some of these threats that were going on before or things preventing them from being able to vote. Next, June 1868, Congress seated representatives from 7 reconstructed states. So 7 is the number there. In other words, finally, the southern states were voting in people that weren't former Confederates, and they were allowing them to take their seats in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. This also allowed African Americans to take place in politics. So in our next little section there, first bullet point, they were being elected as sheriffs, mayors, and judges, and legislators. So sheriffs, mayors, and judges are those 3 blanks. Also, 16 African Americans served in the House of Representatives. That's the next blank. From 1872 to 1901. This was a big deal. And then final bullet point, senators like Hiram Revels, Hiram Revels, and Blanche Bruce, Blanche Bruce. These 2 men were actually senators in the Senate, in the United States federal government. So lots of progress here, lots of progress. Reconstruction advancements. These are things that were happening, especially in southern states, that were a big deal. Like things like these that needed to happen, that Reconstruction was actually ushering in. One of those, first bullet point, they opened public schools. So public schools is the first blank in the southern states, as the parentheses have there. This was a big deal because there were already a lot of public schools in the North that were funded by the government, things like that. The South didn't have a lot of public schools for whites or African Americans, so just opening public schools was a big deal. Second bullet point, they spread taxes evenly. So taxes is that next bullet point. Third bullet point, made fairer voting rules. So voting is the blank. Next bullet point, gave property rights to women. Property rights, so that's even an advancement in allowing women to have certain rights that they didn't have before. And then final bullet point, rebuilt bridges, roads, and buildings destroyed by war. I'll say that again. bridges, roads, and buildings that were destroyed by war. So again, making it possible for transportation and transporting goods and people from place to place down in the South. That needed to happen too. So Republicans in the South, the Republicans, which is what Lincoln was hoping, that there would be a strong Republican base in the South. And they did now, and there were three key groups that were helping this. Okay, number one, first group, the Scalawags. Scalawags. Now, the Scalawags were Southern whites who were opposed to secession. So people who never wanted to see the South secede from the Union in the first place. They became part of the strong Republican base in the South. Secondly, the freedmen, the people who were in slavery, who were no longer, they were now free. They joined the Republican base in the South. And third, the carpetbaggers. The carpetbaggers, this was a name given by Southerners to Northern whites who went to start businesses or pursue political office in the South. Kind of a group that was taking advantage of the situation, where they knew that the South was trying to revive itself. So they saw it as an opportunity, again, to go down, start businesses, take political office, things like that. But they were the carpetbaggers. They got their name because they said all they basically did was throw their stuff in a bag and run down to the South and try to seek opportunities. So moving on, again, coming back, recircling to President Johnson. He's going to kind of become a target for the radical Republicans. They're looking to, even though Johnson himself is a Republican, they're looking to remove him, the radicals, that is, from office. So radicals tried to remove, that's your first blank there, remove Johnson from office by impeachment. That's the second blank, and I have that defined here. Impeachment is the bringing of formal charges against a public official. So in other words, if they committed some type of crime, treason, things like that, you can impeach them, which is the bringing of formal charges, okay? Second bullet point there, Johnson, and this is what they were using, at least, because they weren't fond of him anyway, but they were using this to try to get him and impeach him. Johnson removed the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton. Edwin, Edwin, middle initial M, Stanton, Stanton. He just removed him from his office, and the radicals were saying that is a violation of the Tenure of Office Act. That's the next blank. Tenure is spelled Tenure, of office. All right, that was an act that restricted the power of the president to remove certain office holders without the power of the Senate. Johnson had vetoed it, so they're saying that that was a violation there and grounds for impeachment. So the Senate has a trial, that's what happens, and they voted 35 for impeachment. 35 and 19 were against Johnson. So they were one vote short of the 2/3 majority that they needed to actually remove him from office. So again, impeachment charges were brought against him, but he was not removed from office because during the trial, the Senate didn't have enough votes to remove him. So last bullet point, he remained in office. First president to be impeached, though. Okay. Next, if you move to the back of that page, is the election of 1868. So the war hero, Ulysses S. Grant, Ulysses, middle initial S, and then Grant, Grant, won the presidency for the Republicans. So Ulysses S. Grant is the first blank, Republicans is the second blank. Now, Grant was considered, in political terms, a moderate. So moderate is that next blank. And he had a lot of support from Northern business leaders. So this helped him to win the election. And also, some 500,000 African Americans voted in this election. So African Americans is that blank. Because so many things were put in place in the South, and the African Americans weren't prohibited from voting. Many of them voted clearly, and they voted mainly for Republicans. So that helped Grant to get into office. Fourth bullet point, because of all this, the radical Republicans started to lose the grip of the Republican Party. So radical is that blank. Next up, the 15th Amendment will end up getting passed here. The 15th Amendment gives us the right to vote, vote's the first blank, no matter race, next blank, color, next blank, or servitude. So this, of course, is another step towards people not being able to allow people to vote. And primarily here, it would have been African Americans. So first bullet point, this barred all states from denying African Americans, first, that's the blank there, the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In other words, that last part means just because you were once a slave, that does not mean that they can prevent you from voting. You are now an American citizen and you have the right to vote. Second bullet point, this was opposed by Democrats. So Democrats is the next blank, yet it was still approved by Congress. Third bullet point, African Americans thought it weak. However, that's the first blank. They thought it was weak because it didn't prevent states from denying votes over owning property. So property is the next blank, or paying a voting tax. That's the third blank there. And in your worksheets that you did, hopefully you remember that there were some things that they put into play in the South as the radical Reconstruction kind of came to an end. Things were happening, like they were trying to have a poll tax or a voting tax that you had to pay to vote. That's not the intent of the 15th Amendment, but yet they were putting that into play. Or they were saying you had to own property. Well, African Americans just coming out of slavery didn't have the ability to own any property yet because of money issues and things like that. So these were things that they were using to deny African Americans the right to vote. Last bullet point, the amendment took effect in 1870. After 3/4, that's your blank there, 3/4 of the states approved it. So in amidst all of this, these amendments being passed that were needed and excellent progress in our United States Constitution, there were people that were angered by all of these things that were happening in the South. So what we're going to see, and we're under the next section of the Ku Klux Klan, there were secret societies. That's our first bullet point. Secret societies, first blank, were created by angered whites who were shut out of power. Power is the last blank. Again, some of the point of all of this was so that the Confederates that believed in secession and were kind of the leaders in the Confederacy couldn't take power. They were being shut out. They were angered. They start these secret societies. The purpose of these societies? To terrorize African Americans and their white allies. So terrorize is the next blank. The best known of all these secret societies was the Ku Klux Klan. So best known, that's your next blank. They wore white robes with hoods to hide their faces. So hoods are the first. As a matter of fact, I have a picture from the book that I'm going to show you. Here's a picture of a cartoon of what a Klansman might look like with the hood and the white garment. And this is an actual cap that they would have worn. Secondly, Klansmen shouted threats and burned wooden crosses, that's the next blank, by night at African American homes. So whatever they were trying to get across, they would shout these threats. Maybe they didn't want them to vote in the next election. Maybe they wanted them to leave the neighborhood. Whatever it would be, that's what they were doing, shouting these threats. When these threats failed, these are the things that the Klansmen would do. They would whip, torture, shoot, or hang. Those are the 4 stars that I have there. Whip, torture, shoot, or hang both African Americans and white Republicans. Republicans is the blank there. Hundreds of people were killed during the election of 1868, the one where Grant was elected president. The blank there is election of 1868. Again, when you have people, that secret societies like the Klan, the KKK, they're also known as, trying to prevent African Americans from voting or make it very hard on white Republicans to do the things they were trying to do also. This is what you have: violence and killing. Next blank. The Ku Klux Klan Acts of 1870 and 71 were passed by Congress. So Congress is that next blank. In retaliation to try to keep these things from happening. What they did was they barred the use of force against voters. Force is your blank there. And then finally, African Americans voting, unfortunately, declined. Declined is the word, due to terrorism. They were scared. Their lives were being threatened. People that they knew were being killed and tortured and hanged. So it forced them to feel that they couldn't vote for threat of their lives. So the voting declined because of all this terrorism. This was basically a sign, or a stage was being set, we could put it that way, that Reconstruction was coming to an end. So that's the last blank there, is Reconstruction. All right, so you guys are going to have a test coming up soon. I'll have a little bit more information about that for you. So that'll be all for our notes, though, on Reconstruction and Chapter 16.